Greetings, welcome to the joint HERDSA Assessment Quality SIG and Transforming Assessment ASCILITE SIG joint session. Today's session is the topic of reimagining assessment in uncertain times. Priya, would you like to do the introduction, please?
Thank you so much, Matthew, and a very warm welcome to everyone, and a very warm welcome to David and Peter, our speakers. My name is Priya, and I am an academic at the School of Clinical Medicine in University of New South Wales in Australia, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the HERDSA's Special Interest Group in Assessment. I'll be moderating this session with Matthew. So we would like to begin the session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we all are joining in today. I am joining in from the wonderful Darug lands here in the northwest of the Eora Nation, and I invite you to share the lands from where you are joining from in the chat. Also, my deepest respects to any First Nations people joining us today. So we are really thrilled to have two wonderful speakers today. First up, we have Professor David Tree on an innovative approach in assessments, basically integrated and synoptic assessments. And then at 6:30, we'll be joined by Professor Peter Bryant, who is going to deliver a provocative talk on the nuances of AI and the impact in higher education. Okay, so it is a real pleasure to introduce Professor David Tree, who is Vice Dean for Education and Professor of Life Sciences Education at the Brunel University London. Along with your fascinating research, David, in cell and developmental biology, you have been a leading voice in integrated and synoptic assessment, and now you're championing the assessment for equity, inclusiveness, and accessibility across higher education. So a very warm welcome to you, David, and thank you so much for joining this early in the morning. And I hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you ever so much to everyone for inviting me here today. Before I start talking for about half an hour, can you hear me okay, and can you see my slides?
Yep, we can hear you okay, and we can see your slides. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about integrated and synoptic assessments at Brunel University London, which is quite an old story now, but it's an ongoing story. And in a slight change from the advertised title, I'm going to talk towards the end about some new stuff that I've been doing, interacting with some colleagues, in which the integrative assessments haven't worked as well as they have done in other cases. And actually, I think that we can also learn a lot from when things go wrong as well as when things go right, and what we do in response to that. So I'll come on to that in a moment. So I'm going to start off by talking about a story that started 15 years ago. So I'm now the Vice Dean Education in the College of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences. And in 2010, I was the level 5, so the second of the 3 undergraduate years. I was the level 5 coordinator of the BSc in Biomedical Sciences at Brunel University London. So here I am, and this is to kind of show that this work was done very much collaboratively, and the importance of collaboration and teamwork are going to be a theme we're going to come back to quite a lot here. But my role in this was to design the assessments for the second years of 3 years, and I coordinated the activity of something like 10 or 15 colleagues, most of whom were older and less junior than me. And that was a really formative and interesting experience that I've learned a lot from. And there were colleagues who were coordinating the activities of the people who were designing the assessments in the first year and in the final year as well. And then there were colleagues who had overarching interests in this. And there were some people who thought this was a terrible idea and was never going to work. So that was also quite interesting from a group work point of view. But where were we 15 years ago on the biomedical sciences? Well, actually, we were facing many of the same problems that we're facing today and that teams face. There's nothing particularly new about this, but what we found is that there was a very heavy burden of assessment on our undergraduate program. We were increasing our student numbers. From when I started, we had something like 80 or 90 students. By this point, we had 150 or so students, and we hadn't increased the number of staff. And then the government took the caps off numbers of students we could recruit to programs. And so we went from 150 to 250 and 300. And so we needed to deal somehow with this workload issue for staff, but we also thought this was a terrible workload issue for students as well. The program at this point was very traditionally assessed, and I'll show you that in a few moments, but there were lots and lots of very low credit bearing pieces of assessment, which were all very traditional: essays, lab reports, because this is a science degree. It was all a bit meat and potatoes, and we wanted to bring some more interesting applied assessments involved into it. And we also wanted to improve our graduate attributes of our students. We wanted to very explicitly assess them on the application of knowledge rather than just the kind of the reproduction of knowledge. And we wanted to develop a range of skills in them, not just writing reports and writing essays. The other thing we were really interested in dealing with was tackling in-silo learning, which is a real feature of modularization, certainly in the UK. And this was always brought out to me when I taught the second year's genetics. So I studied genetics for a living, and I used to teach this, and I still do teach it. I'll be there again on Monday morning. I teach the second year's genetics, and at this point I taught them cancer biology in the final year, because that's also something I work on. And they never remembered the fact that I taught them all sorts of genetics, and it was compulsory, so they'd all had me the previous year. None of them were ever able to apply the things that I'd learned in a module in the second year in the third year. And we thought that was because there was very modular learning on the program, and we really wanted to tackle that as well, because we think, again, this is how we really develop graduate skills. And an opportunity to do this came where the Senate regulations were changed in 2009, and this uncoupled teaching and assessment. And people always think, and I talk to colleagues around the UK about this very frequently, and they think there's some kind of magic or there's some, you know, amazing thing that's done. But the Senate regulation changes were really quite negligible. They were just changed from students would normally take modules to the value of at least 120 credits at each level to students will take the equivalent of 120 credits of assessment. And that very slight change in wording allowed us to invent something called teaching blocks, study blocks, and assessment blocks. So if in this cartoon at the top here, I'm showing modules, below it I'm showing study blocks and assessment blocks. Now in a modular program, the teaching and assessment are literally in the paperwork on the same piece of paper, and every assessment is solely concerned with the teaching on the module. So there's a very linear, very siloed basis for both teaching and assessment. And what we created at Brunel, and this wasn't me, this was a guy called Derek Milligan, and then my boss, Marianne Rand-Weaver, really understood this at a deep level, was that this change to the Senate regulations allowed us to separate study and assessment, so that study could still exist in lectures and seminars, and that was just fine. And actually we had then, instead of a module outline, we have a study block outline that contains the indicative content and the learning outcomes that flow from that study block. But then separate to that, we have assessment blocks. And in order for students to be successful at the study blocks, students have to integrate knowledge and experience and ideas from different study blocks. So the assessments are synoptic, they are overarching, and they are integrative. They require students to bring together knowledge from different areas in order to achieve the learning outcomes for that module. And in a longer talk, I have a whole load of things I would say about program level learning outcomes, but I didn't want to get into that. But this is a really important point in that this reflects real life and helps students to develop their graduateness. Because in real life, we integrate everything we know from every part of the world that we've ever experienced to solve problems. And that, we thought, it really reflects real life And it's funny, whenever we talk to external examiners or academics, and funnily enough, when I talk about this at open days, the students look a bit blank, but the parents always go, oh yeah, that's a good point. And that just seems to make sense to us. Now, there's a lot of confusion in some of the literature and in some of the conversations about this, about what I'm talking about when I talk about integrated program assessment, because there's another kind of pedagogical process called programmatic assessment. And this cartoon is just demonstrating the difference in my experience between programmatic assessment and integrative program assessment. Now, this is how assessment is done in our medical school. And so I'm kind of cartooning a block of teaching here, but in a single module and actually throughout the year in our medical school, in programmatic assessment, what happens is that in almost every teaching session, or at least very frequently throughout the year, students are assessed throughout the program in a programmatic way. And then at the end of the block, there is a larger assessment, which is often made up of things from these smaller assessments. But there's no integration here. There's no synoptic nature, in my experience, of this kind of assessment. So it's a different kind of assessment, and it's very valid and very good. And as I say, our medical school uses it. But programmatic assessment involves more assessment with a very light touch throughout to ensure engagement and to ensure outcomes are met. Whereas programmatic assessment or integrative program assessment that I talk about, there's many less assessments. They're higher stakes, and we will talk about formative experiences that students have, but there's less assessments and they're always integrative, and that's really important. So just to talk about the benefits of this briefly before I talk about some specifics on biomedical sciences, what we achieved by doing this was to reduce the summative assessment load by 2/3. We do a lot less marking and the students do a lot less assessment. And we think we've made the assessments a lot more interesting and fun to do, both to set and to mark and to do for the students. And they apply critical and analytical thinking and apply the knowledge a lot more. And we think it's improved the student experience and outcomes. So here are the degree outcomes. The number of firsts and 2-1s have actually gone up. And this continues. So this is older data, but this is a much better experiment because as I mentioned, the cap came off student numbers a couple of years after this. And so the population of students we had got bigger and changed in some other aspects. And so this is a much better experiment to show that with very much the same group of students, the student outcome actually increased. And the graduate level employment increased as well. So here in the dark blue bar, I'm showing the percentage of students who report 3 years after graduation. So this is the Delhi data that the government produces in the UK, the destination of leavers of higher education. And the number of biology students who come out of biomedical sciences in graduate level employment increased in this period and that we're kind of controlling for that with the Department of Life Sciences at Brunel at the time, which contained sports sciences, psychology, environmental sciences, and biosciences. So let's get to the nitty-gritty of what I'm talking about here. Here is what the program looked like in the first year before we had IPA. And there were modules, so every assessment only related to knowledge and skills that they were producing in that module. And you can see that we have quite a traditional form of assessment here. And there's something like 17 assessments that students did throughout the year. So what we did was we stripped out the assessments. We kept the teaching much the same. We did this kind of, one of the common questions I get asked is, this took us about 6 months to do kind of as a team. And I'll talk about the teamwork in that. So we kept the teaching very much the same. And so the modules became study blocks, which was just a minor change in the paperwork, but the teaching was much the same in laboratories and seminar rooms and laboratory practicals. And we produced all these new, not all these new, only 6 per year assessment blocks. And the assessment blocks were overarching. There was every year there is 4 courseworks, And so this allowed us to spread these out very nicely throughout the 2 terms. And then there was always 2 exam assessment blocks at the end. One subject-specific exam assessment block, which was very normal subject-specific knowledge, and one synoptic exam, which I'll talk about later. So if you then think about how this works, students are assessed on knowledge and skills from each study block in multiple assessment blocks. So here I'm showing anatomy and physiology is assessed in multiple different assessments. They have to apply their knowledge of anatomy and physiology in lots of different places. Whereas in each assessment, knowledge is drawn together from different places. And here I'm using the example of the biomedical sciences, which is not a synoptic exam, but they have to use knowledge and experience from all those different places to answer questions on that exam successfully. And so then when I map this across, it shows this very complicated and slightly overwhelming diagram here, which is that this is a truly integrated program. Students have to draw together knowledge and understanding and skills from all over their study in order to be successful in each assessment. And this is a little overwhelming, so I'll give you an example at level 4 at the first year and an example in the second year to help you understand this. So here I'm going to describe an assessment called practical skills microscopy. So we are biologists. Lots of things in biology are very small, and in order to look at them, we use microscopes to make them visible to the human eye. And so microscopes are used in lots of different study blocks, both theoretically and then practically. And so students are drawing together in this assessment block knowledge and skills and understanding from lots of different study blocks, from anatomy and physiology, where they've learned what the gut looks like, in the biology of the cell, where they've learned what different kind of bacteria look like that can either make you sick or are just normally present in your gut, in practical skills, where they've learned how to count cells, and in research skills, where they've learned how to use a microscope appropriately. So when they've had all of this teaching, and the timing of these assessments with the teaching is quite important, but students are then faced with a case study of someone with a tummy ache, abdominal pain. And this could be caused by structural changes to their gut, too many normal bacteria in their gut, or a bacterial infection, something that isn't there, which could be causing them to get sick. So in order to be successful in this assessment, we give students a lot of data and information that they're very familiar with from their study blocks, and they have to make sense of that and then present it. And it used to be a lab report long ago, and now it is something very different in the age of AI, but that's not the subject of this talk. That's the subject of the next talk. Now, I mentioned that my role in this was to coordinate at level 5. And so actually this was very exciting and quite formative for me, because I had to make sure that there was coherence between the assessments that the students experienced at level 4, and that the level 5 assessments were building on that. And then they learned everything they needed to learn in level 5 in the second year in order to be successful in level 6 in their final year. And so I find scaffolding of assessment, sustainability of assessment really important and exciting. And again, that's a topic for another talk. And I'll give you another example. So here's the second year study blocks and assessment blocks. And again, here is a slightly confusing diagram with the kind of integrative nature of the program, how they have to draw together knowledge from all these different areas in order to be successful in their assessments. I'm going to give you my favorite example, which is called data analysis, interpretation, and presentation, where again, we give the students a case study and we give them a lot of raw data, which if you're not a biological audience, there's no reason you'd understand this, but we're giving them data that they should be familiar with from lots of their different study blocks. And they have to draw together knowledge and understanding and abilities from all those different areas in order to analyze that and to come to a conclusion about the human health condition that we're talking about. So they need to basically make a poster that they present in a kind of pretend symposium that we have. And this is absolutely amazing. The students really enjoy it. They take it very seriously. It's just like their first poster presentation when they are a PhD student or they've gone out to work in biotech or pharma. And so here's an example of a much younger looking me in the corner and my colleague Elizabeth here talking to students at their posters, where we have an interaction with them. And I'm not going to read this quote from a graduate here. So this was a couple of years after she'd graduated. A student emailed us out of the blue to say, that was amazing. That really prepared me for working in pharmaceuticals, where you have to do this kind of thing all the time. That kind of integrative assessment, but then that presentation of understanding in a kind of one-to-one way was really important and really helped her. Now, I should mention, so I did talk about the integration and the scaffolding between years. So this is a second year presentation. They'd done 2 presentations in their first year in much larger groups. They do this in pairs or threes in their second year. And then in their final year, they do a presentation individually. So again, we've tried to make sure that the assessments are well designed for scaffolding for students. So we're not jumping anything on them. We're not surprising them with any assessment that they haven't been prepared for in previous years. And again, that's another one of my interests. Finally, with biomedical sciences, I'll talk about a particular assessment in the final year, which I think illustrates how you can use this kind of integrative assessment in a world of options when not all students are taking the same thing. So in their final year, the students all do options and they're all assessed in those options. And there's something like 10 of those options, 4 in the first term, and well, they do 1 from 4 in the first semester and 3 from 6 in the second semester. And those assessments are drawn together in coursework that they do. So I'll talk a little bit about this coursework, where students make a portfolio of work from 3 options. So they're doing options in their final year that are very much based on the research careers of some of our colleagues in that. And for each of these, they do completely different work. So there's nothing integrative per se about this coursework. They have to do coursework that's specific for the option they're doing, but they all involve problem solving and data analysis. So they all fulfill the same learning outcomes, and they're all in the same written form. So we put them in the form of a Nature brief communication, which is a very kind of high profile journal. So again, we're trying to keep authenticity and kind of real worldness of the assessment, but they're all doing the same thing. I mentioned earlier that we're giving all students the same learning opportunities. And here, you know, in some programs where you have options in the final year, what students do will be based on what the interest of the academic is and how they want to assess it. And here we are giving all students the same assessment opportunities, and we've scaffolded and organized that very carefully as well. So in this case, each piece of coursework is not synoptic, but there's a reflective element at the end of this where students have to draw together and think about their studies and how they've drawn together different things. And I think of that as being students developing the answer to a question in an interview. Okay, so every year there are subject-specific exams, which are very normal and just kind of unseen exams where the students go and sit in a room with 500 other students and write about their knowledge, which is, I think, fine. But there's also a synoptic exam, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So the synoptic exam requires students to integrate knowledge from around the degree and the wider subject area. Especially later in the degree, it's requiring them to have read the research literature and show understanding of ethical issues. And this is a seen exam. But the way that the question is phrased is very open. So whatever students have done, they can draw together their own knowledge and understanding and show their learning and understanding. And this is absolutely brilliant. And every day, so they have a synoptic exam every level. Every year it gets more difficult and complex, and students do really well in this. And it's a really great assessment. So I'm just going to conclude my part about the biomedical sciences briefly to say that there are challenges in this. Every time I talk about this, people want to talk about the challenges, and I'll return to that at the end here. And the real problem is getting over the idea that the module belongs to the person who delivers the module, it's theirs, and you're messing with it. Why are you doing this? And that is a problem. What I would always say is that your module doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the university. It belongs to the program. It belongs to the students. And I get resistance about that every time I say it. Another problem is that staff need to know more about what and how colleagues teach in order to set these overarching assessments. So I, for many years, was involved in these second year assessments that involved me, someone who studies genetics, like how diseases are inherited and how changes in DNA lead to changes that lead to human health conditions. I am not an infectious disease person. So I have to learn and understand something about my infectious diseases colleagues' work. And so I have to learn about how and what my colleagues teach in order to design this overarching assessment. And some people will say, well, why should I do that? Why do I have to do that? And I say that makes the program better. It makes you better. You know, I'm not asking you to do a PhD in something. I'm asking you to understand something at an undergraduate level. And I think, and my experience is that we can all do this. And it's not either difficult or impossible, but it involves opening your mind and being unafraid to do that. But then obviously then you have multiple markers for assessment, which involves calibration and moderation. And I actually think that this leads to more consistency and better quality marking rather than better quality marking. Before this, when you had options in a program, you would have external examiners looking at those, and autonomously they all seemed consistent, but they never talked to each other. And when you have options in the final year that aren't integrative, often the assessments, the markers aren't talking to each other. And so this actually, through this process of calibration and moderation, and we document it to a very great degree, I think it leads to an increase in confidence in our marks. And you do need to be creative with synoptic assessment, but that's much more fun. I would rather, and I'll talk at the end about the upfront costs of this. It is so much more fun and enjoyable to design an interesting assessment rather than having to mark hundreds of boring assessments. And that's just the way it is. So those are some of the challenges. The benefits are that the assessments are reduced. Some people would rather do more work on their own, and there will always be those people. But this shared marking and teaching and becoming a community property has really improved the teamwork and improved the ethos, and everyone is just happier. There's psychology about identity and team identity that I don't know about, but I believe it's true. The students have fewer, more interesting assessments. They still do things that used to be summative have now become formative learning activities. And when they engage with that, that really improves their outcomes, and students are able to recognize their graduate attributes better. I've already showed you that the students have better outcomes. They're better prepared for employment. The National Student Survey, our student satisfaction measure went up, and it's been highlighted as evidence of good practice by lots of professional bodies. And often, you know, we'll talk in a little bit about resistance to this. People will always say, oh, our professional body wouldn't let us do it. And I have never met a professional body who didn't absolutely love it. So really, you know, the main challenge of doing this is the team. But that's the main strength if you can make it work. And it's not actually that difficult to make it work. Making a team work together is a challenge, but like I say, it really works when it works. So that was kind of a story from a while ago. And what's happened since then? Well, IPA, Integrative Program Assessment, has been used throughout Brunel. Biomedical Sciences was the first program that did it, but it was so successful that we have kind of preached that gospel and done lots of things throughout the university. And as you can see on the right hand side here, I've got a very partial list of different programs that have used it, and there are lots of different areas that have used it. I think that there are probably some areas where it works better than others, but I would claim that you could make it work absolutely everywhere. Now, Biomedical Sciences went all in on study and assessment blocks. Everything was study and assessment blocks, and it was fully integrative. But different programs have found ways of adapting IPA methodology to their own purposes in different places. And certainly a mixed economy of integrated and modular assessments is possible. So I'm going to give you some examples of different ways in which it's been used throughout Brunel, and I'll end with a slightly less positive outcome, but I think that also teaches us lessons. So I was involved in the School of Design. So the design school is quite a large institution at Brunel. It's in the engineering school, so very different to me in life sciences. And they have a bunch of different programs. And I'm showing a diagram of one of those programs here. So I think I'm showing industrial design here. And what you can see is that in light orange are study blocks, and in dark orange are modules, and in gray are the assessment blocks. And in years 1, 2, 3, and 4, although more in years 1 and 2, there are study blocks and assessment blocks. And in order to be successful in the assessment blocks, students have to draw together knowledge and understanding from multiple study blocks. And this works really well in design, just as it does in biomedical sciences, because often you're looking at an overarching problem, and when you are a designer or a scientist, you don't just think in those boxes. You have to bring together your knowledge from lots of different places to do a project. And so actually their level 7, so their master's level year, is fully integrative. And that worked really well. So another example that I think is salutary and interesting is a program that I actually designed called the Life Sciences BSc. So this slightly confusing diagram shows what in some cases are study and assessment blocks, but it's quite a linear modular structure. So mostly assessments are not integrative in this, because this program allows students to take study and assessment from 6 other programs to make their own interdisciplinary degree. But I didn't want it to be multidisciplinary. I wanted it to be interdisciplinary. And the only way of forcing students to think about 2 things together is to assess them in it. And so every year I designed synoptic, overarching coursework that students had to draw together knowledge and understanding from lots of different places in order to be successful. And so these started with a very well supported piece of coursework where students learn how to read papers in the first year. And this is the subject of a much longer talk that I don't have time for today. But then having taught them how to read papers, that they have to understand all the different areas of study in order to read the papers, we asked them to write an interdisciplinary review paper in the second year. And then in the final year, we ask students to attend research seminars in their different areas and then compare and contrast the research cultures in the research centers in their different areas of study. And so despite the fact that this is a very modular program, in order to get that synoptic nature of learning and understanding, I designed assessments that required students to use that. So finally, and I'm running up against my half hour now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the psychology degree at Brunel. And I was involved in designing this program. And at this point, I was the director of teaching and learning in the department that contained the psychology degree. So I was strongly involved with this. And so the idea here was to use a mix of study blocks and assessment blocks to design overarching integrative assessments, but then also to have some modular assessment as well. And in psychology, there's lots of overlaps between different subjects, but students often think of them in silos. And so the hope here was to foster integration by having students have to draw together knowledge and understanding from different study blocks to be successful in the assessment blocks. And that was the hope. And here is a list that isn't as attractive to the mind as a diagram. So this is the first year of the psychology BSc. And it's interesting. So almost all psychology degrees in the UK are accredited by the British Psychological Association Society. Society, and getting my PBSRAs mixed up. And so here we tried something different. So there were a bunch of modules where the assessments were just linked to the study in that module. But then we also designed overarching integrative assessments for some things. So in the first year, there were portfolios they made for academic skills and career skills. And then they were supposed to bring together knowledge and understanding in research methods and statistics, which is actually a great combination, in order to write a portfolio for research methods and statistics. And in the second year, again, there were some modules, but then there were 3 assessment blocks that drew together knowledge and understanding from different areas of their study there. So biological psychology and cognitive psychology are strongly related disciplines, and so they drew together those in the portfolio for cognitive neuroscience. And social psychology and individual differences are also very similar topics, and so they drew together those into another portfolio of assessments. And the outcomes from a student experience point of view were not as strong as they had been on biomedical sciences. So we thought, or the program team thought, that they had kind of communicated this idea very strongly to the students, but the students never really fully understand the link, or the link in the assessment between the 2 areas, and they couldn't really get their heads around that. But more importantly was that the staff didn't really like it or understand it or draw into it at all. And this is a quote from a colleague who said that the staff all saw the assessment as belonging to their study block. And you would have seen that they were all called portfolio 4. And what we found was that within those portfolios, they were very multidisciplinary. So in the portfolio, you had a section on biological psychology and a section on cognitive psychology, and then an attempt at some synoptic overarching integrative thought that wasn't very successful because neither of the academics had really bought into it. And they managed to add research method questions into a stats exam, but those questions were still just about one set of ideas. They weren't actually synoptic, they weren't overarching. And so we don't think that pedagogically this worked very well. And actually, an interesting example of this is that the colleagues were very unwilling to share their VLE. So the online nature of this was actually even separate. And they had separate parts of the assessment on the VLE, which was not ideal. So this didn't really reduce the workload for the students. It didn't really didn't get rid of confusion for students, and there was no integrative nature to this. So it wasn't really very successful. But actually, interestingly, there's been a push in my institution for reorganization of things from 10 and 20 credits into 30 credit modules. And actually, what's happening now is that the program is being reorganized into these larger modules, and actually it's recapitulating the IPA structure anyway in a more successful way, which is just kind of bizarre and interesting. So the research methods and statistics have now been put together in a larger module. Biological and cognitive psychology are together. Social psychology and individual differences are together in a larger module. And actually these combinations make sense. And what this tells us is that you can't really force, or you can try and force. I mean, in my example of biomedical sciences, between a quarter and a third of people really disliked it to begin with. But over time, the culture changed and it just became the norm. But you can't sometimes force that. And so what I think makes integration work is that you need to have problems that students need to solve. It needs to be natural. So you can try and tell a program team to do integrative assessment, but if it isn't applied to their natural way of doing a subject, it doesn't really work. What we found certainly with the synoptic exams was that open-ended questions really worked well, and they enabled student engagement. And we found that this scaffolding complexity across levels really worked as well. A reality is that there's less assessment on this kind of regime, and we think that means more learning in successful outcomes, but that institutional barriers can be a problem, and you need to acknowledge the invisible labor that goes on in both coordination, getting colleagues together, negotiating synoptic overarching assessments, and then maintaining that in the culture. In biomedical sciences, we have very low staff turnover, and that's been very positive, so that when new staff do come in, they are brought into the community, and this is the way things are done in this village. Whereas in psychology, they have a much higher staff turnover, and so there was never really a culture of doing this that persisted. Disciplinary context matters. I think this is part of a larger talk I could talk about, but there's some disciplines that seem to make this work better. And actually, the psychology example shows that when content belongs together, integration can happen within conventional modules as well. But to get back to my point at the end of biomedical sciences, is that the team culture is the most important thing. Getting that right is the most important thing. And that can be imposed, but it's better if it comes from the ground up. With the biomedical sciences, we were led by Marianne Randweaver, our head of department, but she really empowered everyone at the different levels to come up with their own solutions to problems, and that worked really well, and we think that's a key. And we're doing some research at the moment on different places in Brunel where it's worked really well and it hasn't worked, and it's that team ethos, the leadership that lets people solve problems themselves and be empowered, that really works. So anyway, I will stop talking now. I've gone over my half an hour, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fascinating. And I absolutely loved the conclusion that you had there, that the structure can be copied, but the culture has to be inculcated. So that was brilliant. We have a number of questions actually for you from the audience, and I'll start asking one by one. So first question is, where do students have the opportunity to practice integrating the information before assessment?
So they have formative activities that are spread across the program, and then so those are done kind of not. So I showed the programmatic assessment where there's assessment everywhere. Well, there's formative opportunities to do things for the students throughout, and it's always built up. So when I teach genetics, it's kind of like a little bit like teaching French, and you build up knowledge. Automatically use French as a foreign language, but whatever language you're learning, whatever thing you're learning, if you're learning guitar, you build on everything else, and it is naturally integrative. And then we're slowly drawing that in the formative tasks. And then, so what was nice about the program is that there's 4 pieces of coursework every year. So midway through the first semester, they draw together things. At the end of the first semester, they draw together things. And so these are they're naturally drawing together more things as they go along. So it really is baked into the design of the program.
Right. Thanks, David. The second question is around any study on associated skills, teamwork, poster, conference presentations.
Well, so there's a big part of that talk where I talk about program level learning outcomes, and the program level learning outcomes are all based on skills apart from one, which is about knowledge. And so the skills are naturally developed within the program, kind of presentation skills I mentioned, but then kind of data analysis skills, data presentation skills are naturally baked in. The students have those formative opportunities to do it. And oddly enough, I'm starting to use AI to give students formative feedback during the lectures on work they do within the lectures. And so I'm trying to improve their assessment and feedback literacy through doing that. And that is baked into the whole thing. The development of skills is designed through the program, and kind of hopefully then that metacognitive looking back at the presentation I did last year, the piece of writing I did last year. Do I need to improve my communication skills? Do I need to improve my referencing? Did my my figure legends not work last time? They're all designed to hopefully build one on the other.
Although, David, we didn't talk about AI, but I think this would have solved the problem of assessment, assurance of learning or integrity, given that, you've got rid of individual assignments and essays, and now you have some more integrated written submissions.
You'd hope so, but no. I mean, no one thing is ever a silver bullet. One thing I'd say is that because we have a variety of assessments every year, then the students you're not basing your final grade for the year on one thing. So there's two exams, one's synoptic and seen, one's unseen. There's usually a presentation every year. There's some written work, and we've made some affordances for AI in that. And so there are different ways, but no one thing is a silver bullet, as I'm sure we all know.
Okay, another question is that in terms of keeping students motivated to attend classes regularly and not just focus on working on assessments, what is the approach for consistent engagement?
Well, that is if I could solve that, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be sitting on a big pile of money and ice cream. But it's really those formative opportunities to draw together things as they go through their program that then build to the final assessment. So I mentioned that there's an assessment in the middle of the first semester, and often students struggle with that. And what we would say is, well, did you do the formative activity in the lab class where you learned how to use one piece of equipment, and we do some very basic maths around that? And that is one of several things you have to draw together to be successful. And we have a tutorial session in which they go, oh, no, I didn't do that. And then so early on, we try and make them see the value of the formative activity, and they see the value of turning up and engaging. Of course, we try to use universal design for learning as much as we can, so that there's lots of different ways that students can bring together that learning. And again, we have tutorials in which, if we see that students are struggling, we try and point out that if you didn't do it this way, if you didn't learn in the lecture, you could learn in this recording, or there's a textbook.
So very, very much self-directed approach to learning. Yeah. Okay. So another question is about rubrics. Do rubrics have criteria associated with different content for different markers to focus on the same assessment?
We use rubrics. Again, I don't think rubrics are a magic tool, but they do help with consistency of marking, and they do help with consistency of feedback. What I love about this, and I've got an Instagram post from something like 2018 that shows all of us, or a lot of us, marking the synoptic exam around a table. And more than a rubric, it's actually getting together with your colleagues and talking about the assessment while you're setting it. So I have to talk to my friend who's a pathologist and my friend who's a microbiologist about their areas, and we have to talk about that. And then we have to talk about what are the common misconceptions, things that go right or wrong. And what we do is what we used to do is sit around a big table, and we would mark for 2 hours together, and we would pass scripts. Now we don't have scripts anymore, so now we're passing our laptops over the table, but we would have that meeting in which we calibrate ahead of time and then moderate as we're going along. And it's actually that. So yes, we do have rubrics, but it's that human element of getting together and assuring quality that's really important.
Thanks, David. There's a question on feedback. So how do students receive feedback, and how is it structured to promote growth over time?
Well, it will depend on the assessment. So one thing that's nice about a presentation assessment is that you can give feedback in the moment, but obviously students don't really receive that well. well, because they're in the moment of it, right? They're not going to remember something. I probably won't remember if someone said something to me at the end of this. I probably won't remember it tomorrow. But so then they have written feedback. We do have rubrics. We have written comments that hopefully then are pointing them towards the next assessment. This has been my weird obsession from the beginning, that in the assessment description and in the assessment brief, it always says you did a presentation in the first year and you did a poster in the first year. Look at your feedback for that to improve here. And then when they get the feedback, it says next year you will be doing a presentation it'll be the 18th of January this year or next year. You will need to use this feedback in that. And when we're preparing them for their assessment of that presentation, we're trying to get them to use the feedback there. So yeah, it trying to design it in at all levels is just as important as a rubric, or particularly what's written, or policing that.
Here's an interesting question. How do you overcome the temptation to delay assessment until all the modules are completed, as content comes from each module?
The temptation. So sometimes the first assessment in the first semester is not as integrative of the study blocks as it is of their learning in particular. So their first assessment in the second year of the degree is a literature review that they have to do, which is supposed to integrate things from all over their study, or at least they have to understand human disease. So they are writing things. So that's not specific about any study block, really. They're supposed to be engaging with the primary research literature, but they are building on things they've done in the first year, because they've done a lower level version of that in the first year. And that's how we're kind of bringing them back into it. So yes, I do understand that. What I'd counter with that is that I have friends in other subjects that I won't mention who set the coursework in the middle of the term, and then no one comes to the second half of the term because they know the subject of the coursework and they don't engage with anything after that that is not directly relevant to that coursework. So when I mentioned earlier that we didn't really change the teaching, we didn't change the content of the teaching, but sometimes we have to change the staging and the order of the teaching.
Right. And that's very interesting that the decoupling of assessment and teaching came from actually your Senate regulations from the government, so, which is very fascinating for Australian audience. Okay, so the last question that audience have is, do you have part-time students? And if so, how is the integrative assessment approach handled for that cohort?
We don't have part-time students on this program, and that is a weakness of it. Got to give a brief, definitive answer. So oddly enough, when I designed the life sciences program, some of the programs one of the programs it draws study and assessment from is the biomedical sciences program. So we had to find new ways of assessing them, which were much more direct and linear, because they weren't taking everything to do that. And we can have part-time students on that program because the assessment is very linear. Now, another question I often get asked is about reassessment and whether or not how that is difficult. And I don't know why, but it's never been a problem for students because they're supposed to have experienced the whole of the year before we have the exam boards in June, and then they're reassessed in July, September. And almost all able to go back, especially in the VLE, then also in tutorials, and be successful in reassessment.
Fantastic. We are just on the hour, David. Is there any question, Matthew, that I have missed?
Not that I can see. Hassan has actually just put up one now in the text chat if you'd like to see that one. How did students respond to the summative written synoptic assessments that constituted courses, modules, topics discussed? I think the question is mainly about, did they complain about the increased cognitive load, as the assessment would be lots of topics spread across the semester of the year, versus students, I guess, being able to focus on, say, just one specific element of the year, where you would in a normal traditional kind of unit by unit exam.
No, they love it. The synoptic exam is so, it is a glorious thing. So, you know, you always turn up ahead of the exam and hang out with the students and chat to them and try and calm their nerves a bit. And they are so relaxed because and you would think there's a higher cognitive load. And also because I mentioned that the question is always quite general. So students, no matter what they've studied, are able to express themselves. And I actually think that's fine. They appreciate that and they do really well. And again, it's scaffolded every year. So we're not surprising students with anything. We're trying to, you know, we're trying to build cognitive, but not cognitive, we're trying to build psychological safety. There's the phrase. We're trying to build psychological safety with all the assessments as we go through the years. And, you know, designing programs in that kind of almost overly designed way is something I think is actually really important.
Can I just add on to that? Is it a written exam, or is it like an OSCE style stand up and talk exam?
Ooh, it's a written exam. Yeah. And it's under exam conditions. So, you know, these days they could use AI. Previously, they could use Wikipedia to look things up, but it's all them in the assessment. That's an interesting, I've got all sorts of interesting opinions about OSCEs, and a lot of our assessments that used to be written are now have a discursive element that we're doing. We have 4 or 5 of them in the first year, 3 in the second year, and 1 in the final year. So we're scaffolding them again. But anyway, sorry, I don't want to tread on Peter's time.
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating talk. And it seems like we'll have to invite you again for the part 2 of your talk around more data that's coming up regarding equity and inclusiveness. So once again, a huge thanks to you, David, and especially for waking up that early for our talk. So thank you so very much. And we will, are we having a break, say 2-3 minutes break, Matthew, and then we'll start with Peter's talk?
You're the boss.
Yeah, I think we just have quick 2-minute break. And then we'll start a really engaging talk. So please do not leave us, participants. And so we'll have another engaging talk with Peter. So we'll start at 6:30 then. Thank you so much.
Okay, Priya, I will take the opportunity to stop and restart the recording if that's the case, so that it'll make it easier for the upload.